When visitors come to our glossary, they are greeted with a list of terms. Well, it's not really a list, it's a table. And we want the ability for users to click on the terms so that will take them to another page for more detail. Now, we aren't going to have more detail, but we could easily add that at a later time. So we still want this functionality. So we need a link for our term. So let's just go ahead and add an A element there. Let's wrap our term with that element. And then we need to think about what we want to call the file that's going to be responsible for displaying the detail. So we could call it term.php. And that would be okay, I guess, but we are really just displaying the detail. So let's just call it detail. And then we need to think about how we get the term that we want to show the detail for. Well, whenever you click on a link, that's a GET request. And we know that with a GET request, we can use the query string. So we can just add the term as part of the query string. We can add a parameter called term, and then we will essentially output our term again. So this is going to be detail.php (term) equals, and then our term. So it's going to be as easy as that. So if we go and look at this in the browser, then there are our links. And looking at the bottom left-hand corner, we see our URL. That's going to go to detail.php, and term is in the query string. So let's create that detail file. So new file, detail, well, that's inside of views. We don't want that. We want that at the root. So new file, and then detail.php. Let's go ahead and take the contents of index.php and use that as a basis. Because we want this require, we will eventually do something with the view bag. But really what we want to do is check to see if we have a term in the query string. Because if we don't, then there's really nothing to display. And in that case, we could just redirect back to index. So if not is set, and we will use our super global of get and term. So if the term doesn't exist, then we will just redirect. Now we do not have this function. We wrote this outside of our particular project, and I would like to keep just everything inside of this project as much as possible. Now, as far as the CSS and JavaScript and stuff, that is, of course, outside. But let's just keep the PHP inside of our project. So we are going to rewrite our redirect. But it's easy enough, so it's not that big of a deal. Let's go to functions. And we want function redirect. And we, of course, need the URL there. And we set the header called location. And we incorporate the URL there. Now, after we set the location header, we will call die so that the processing is stopped. And so inside of detail.php, we just specify index.php. And there we go. So if the term isn't set, we just go back to index. If it is, then we need to get that term and then read our data so that we can display all of the detail about that term. So we have a function that is going to return all of our terms, and it's called getTerms. So we could have a function called just getTerm, so that it would look like this. We'll say data equals, and we'll call the function getTerm. We will use our get super global. Once again, we do need to validate this though. So let's add a to-do to validate input. And this should get us our data. Now we need to see if we actually have some data to work with. So if data is equal to false, notice that I'm just writing this code first so that we can then implement it later. So if data is false, then we could display a 404 because, technically that particular resource doesn't exist. But let's add a to-do, and I guess we'll just do 404. So if data is false, then we will 404, we will then die. Otherwise, we will pass our data to the detail view and then display that data. So that is essentially going to be our controller. It's not as clean and concise as the index controller, but we are also doing more stuff here. So let's write this getTerm function. Let's go to our file functions, and we will say function getTerm. We need to know what term that we want to get, and we are going to get all of our terms. So we'll say var terms, not var, I'm sorry. I get into a JavaScript mode and just say var all the time, so don't mind me. So we'll get our terms. Now this gives us an array of objects. So we need to iterate over this array so that we can check the term for each object. If the term is equal to what was supplied to the function, then we have a match. We'll just return that. Otherwise, we will return false. And the reason why we're going to return false is because that follows the convention for PHP functions. You know, if we have opened up a file, or rather we attempted to open up a file and for some reason the file didn't exist or something like that, we would have false as our handle. So it's the same concept being applied here. So we want to for each, and we'll say terms as item, and then we will check if item term equals term, then we will return item. Otherwise, if we go through all of the loop, we don't have a match, we will return false. That seems easy enough. So let's look at what else we need to do. If we have our data, if it's false, we 404. Otherwise, we have our view bag, and here we can incorporate our term. So we could say that this is the detail for, and then data term, although we can't really do that, can we? We could do this though. Term equals data term. And then we could just use term here. Now we don't have this view called detail, so let's go ahead and create that. We're going to do that inside of our views folder. So new file, we'll call it detail.view.php. And let's just use what we have for index as the basis for our view in detail. Now, as far as our title is concerned, we could use what we have in our view bag. So for right now, let's do this. We will say view underscore bag, and then our title. Eventually, we would probably want to do something a little bit different, but this is going to be okay for now. So we will have our title, and then we won't have a table because there's no sense in having a table if we are just going to display our information. And right now we just have the definition. So we can just output that with our model and definition. So that should be enough for us to actually test to see if this is going to work. So let's click on any one of these, and that should take us to detail PHP. It does. We have detail for CSS, and that's our title as well. And then we have our definition. So we are working here, except if we make a request for a term that doesn't exist. So if we do something like XML, heaven help us, we of course just get a blank page. Instead, we would want to display a 404, or at least something that says that this wasn't found. But let's also omit the term query parameter, and that should redirect us back to index, and it does. So we're good to go as far as that functionality. We just need to do something if the term doesn't exist. So we could do this. We could create another view for a not found, and it could say, you know, that doesn't exist. So let's do that. Let's create another view, and we'll call this not underscore found dot view dot php. Let's go ahead and just use what we have for index as the basis, or we don't really even need index. We can use detail. So let's use detail. And then we will say, instead of the title here, we will say that not found. This is generic. We don't want to be very specific and say that, hey, this particular thing wasn't found. Eventually, we might want to do that, but we want this to be as generic as possible. So we could have a title that says not found, and then for the content, that doesn't exist. Just something simple. So let's make a request for something that does exist. We of course know that that works. Let's make our request for XML once again. And well, we didn't actually use that view, did we? So let's go to our detail controller. And here we are going to use the view. We are going to use our not_found view. We don't have a model for that, so we will probably get an error. We do. Argument count error. So we could add a default value for our view. And this is just part of development. You know, you're not going to get everything right the first time. If you do, then buy a lottery ticket because you are pretty lucky. Writing software is an evolution thing. You start writing software and then you start adding more things to it that is going to eventually break what you have written, and you just have to go back and fix those particular issues. So there we go. We can see that that is not found and that it doesn't exist. So now we have really a working detail controller and view. If the term is not set in the query string, we go to index PHP. We then get the specified term. If we don't have any data, then it doesn't exist. So we just say not found with our not found view. Otherwise, we use our term for our title, and I don't like this. Let's just use concatenation here because that will allow us to eliminate that term variable, and we don't really need it if all we are doing is just using that for the title. So that makes it a little bit cleaner, but let's of course make sure that I didn't break anything. So we will go to CSS and we still work there. So our application is coming along quite well. We're displaying a list of terms. We're able to view the detail of those terms, but now we also need to incorporate the search so that users can search a term and hopefully get some results. So we will start doing that in the next lesson.